There is a common belief that all the German bombers began life masquerading as civilian aircraft to get around the limitations of the treaties after the First World War. That is true for the most part, but in this case, the Dornier Do-17 was always designed as a passenger mail plane. Although the aircraft did not quite live up to its expectations, it was a very modern design. A retractable landing gear, blended wing, and a decent-sized bomb bay for its military version. First taking to the air on the 23rd of November 1934, the D017 proved to be fast and manoeuvrable, but as it could only carry 6 passengers, there was very little interest from the civilian market. It wasn't until the aircraft was seen by an Air Ministry liaison and he tested the aircraft that he saw its potential. The V4 and V5 were developed. The first production version was the E1. The aircraft saw service during the Spanish Civil War and was faster than anything the Republicans had in the air. Fighting in Spain had shown that there were some flaws with the Luftwaffe design philosophy. The Do-17 went through a couple of upgrades. The forward fuselage was redesigned and more defensive armament was added. With improved engines, the bomb load was raised to 2,205 pounds. The Dornier would see a night fighter variant, and it would become the Do-17. In the lead up to the war and the Spanish conflict, the 17 proved to be effective. It was hampered by a relatively light bomb load and weak defensive armament. While its action during the Spanish Civil War had been encouraging, its shortcomings were far more pronounced when facing a modern fighter force, and in the end only a little more than 3,000 would be produced. The Luftwaffe became a terrible instrument of Hitler's will and came into being in a very short period of time. A mix of inventiveness, hiding bombers in civilian roles, and of negligence from the Western Allies allowed the Luftwaffe to come into being. Once the Nazis felt confident, they began to show the world what they had been working on. The 1st of March 1935 was the official date for the creation of the German Air Force. They had a total of 3,750 aircraft by the time Poland would be invaded. The German aviation industry was still working on a more peacetime setting, yet even that was greater than the other European countries. The Luftwaffe was not tied to the army like some other air forces were. It was seen as a tactical resource. This was both a positive and a negative for them. With the success of Blitzkrieg, it was undeniable as to how effective and how terrifying the Luftwaffe actually was. This led to a situation where they lacked a strategic element. The bombers did not have great range or carry large bomb loads. They were expected to operate close to the front, so range was not a vital factor. During the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe would find that this situation called for a strategic solution, and they just did not have one. The German Air Force was very active in the closing years before the start of the Second World War. They were a key component of the Legion Condor. In support of General Franco in Spain, tactics, crews, aircraft and weapons were all tested. The Luftwaffe would play its part in the annexing of Austria, and on the 15th of March 1938 they supported the invasion of Czechoslovakia. The plan to invade Poland was drawn up quite quickly. Plan White, as it was known, was the first time Blitzkrieg would be utilised. It took the Luftwaffe only 2 days to cripple the Polish Air Force despite some very brave flying from the Poles. The Western Allies were unprepared for Blitzkrieg. The Germans had been preparing for some time, and on the 1st of September 1939 Germany invaded Poland. A massive attack utilising air and ground forces pushed into Poland. The Germans gained air superiority relatively quickly, but it came at a higher cost than expected. The Stuka's legend would be born in Poland. The Stukas coming down in a dive that was at times near vertical was both accurate and terrifying. A total of 31 Stukas would be lost during the Polish campaign. One item of note was that the Heinkel 123 was used during the campaign. Considering the modern nature of the Luftwaffe, this biplane seemed out of place. They also moved airfields at a rapid pace as the front lines constantly changed. LG-2 would move a total of 7 times. 9 bomber wings were flying the Dornier Do-17, and the Dornier was heavily utilised during the Polish campaign. Another interesting fact of the campaign was the Me-110 had considerable success. This heavily armed fighter over a few days had shot down 13 enemy aircraft for the loss of only 3 of its own. This made the 110 appear better than it actually was, and its losses would rise during the Battle of Britain. The Bf-109 is perhaps the most famous German fighter. Their involvement in Poland was far less than that of the 110. This also added to strengthening the idea that the 110 might be the premier fighter that Göring believed it to be. By the 3rd of September, the Luftwaffe was able to allocate more resources against the Polish army. The Poles had fought doggedly and with great bravery. Warsaw had held out for several days while under intense bombing, but eventually fell on the 27th of September. They never really had much chance, as the Soviet Union also invaded them and split the country in two. For the Germans, it proved their tactics and equipment. Poland had fallen in an unprecedented period of time. This in large part to the Luftwaffe. Kesselring wrote, "The Luftwaffe, by virtue of its mobility in space, accomplished tasks which in former wars had been inconceivable." Norway was in a difficult position. Both Britain and Germany had interests in the country. Norway was also not a strong country from a military standpoint. They had iron ore, which was essential to the German war machine. It was also located in a way that the German Navy thought was fortuitous to its operations. The First World War had taught the Germans a great deal after the British blockade. The Navy felt that access to Norwegian ports would negate that. The Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, Gross Admiral Raeder, felt that keeping Norway neutral was still important. When the Soviets invaded Finland in November of 1939, there was a consideration that this might lead to English-French intervention in Norway or Sweden. The latter had exported 10 million tons of iron to Germany in 1939. German intelligence also learned that Winston Churchill, then the First Sea Lord, was pushing for action around Norway. The overall situation convinced Hitler that something needed to be done. The Luftwaffe needed the airfield of Jutland to be able to carry out its missions. This meant that the invasion of Norway also included the invasion of Denmark. Seaborne troop landing and paratroopers would be used. The Navy would also take direct action. Both Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were deployed along with several other large warships and destroyers. The greatest threat to the success of the operation was deemed not to be the Norwegians, but rather the Royal Navy. The Luftwaffe was prepared for anti-shipping missions. Gaining air superiority early was given considerable importance. The outcome was never in serious doubt, yet the Germans took higher losses than expected. The attack itself was lightning. The German Navy engaged the Norwegian coastal ships, and Narvik would be in German hands by evening. It was a similar story with Jutland and Copenhagen. The Norwegian fighter force was a handful of Gladiator biplanes, and they did badly at the hands of the Me-110. Again, the 110 proved itself, and was still considered to be the premier fighter. The weak opposition and good range of the 110 were factors, as was the poor range of the 109, which found itself relegated to a defensive role. With total air superiority, the bombers were able to conduct operations in Norway and against the Royal Navy at their choosing. The Norwegians were not giving up easily, however. The situation became harder for the Germans when the British arrived. The Königsberg was sunk by Blackburn skuas and another vessel sunk by HMS Trident. Lutzow was hit by a torpedo, and the Norwegians sank the Blücher. British ground forces were also able to land. In the end though, the British were unable to really make good on any of their victories during the Norwegian campaign. In part, this was due to the Luftwaffe, which was able to operate more aircraft more effectively. The Norwegian government and Allied forces withdrew from the battle in June 1940.